Benjamin Netanyahu's done it before, making positive noises about a Gaza truce before boarding a plane to America, only for it all to unravel after he lands. For the Israeli Prime Minister's third visit to the White House since Inauguration Day back in January, the noises are more positive than they've been in a while, but hard evidence of progress is thin. And these meetings with Donald Trump always feel loosely scripted, perhaps even improvised. The last time Netanyahu visited the Oval Office, he was ambushed by a host who gushed about Turkey's leader and announced direct talks with Iran. What about this time, after that 12-day war that roped in U.S. fighter planes with Iran? We'll ask about an eventual deal and how to feed Palestinian civilians forced to risk their lives each time they approach one of those U.S. and Israeli-backed aid distribution centers, the ones that bypass international aid agencies. Could Sunday's announcement that Israel's war cabinet approved aid for northern Gaza signal that there's now time being called on that concept? And then there's the rebuilding of a territory that's been flattened. Does Trump still cling to his Gaza Riviera real estate development plan? Does Israel want to occupy Gaza? The U.S. wants normalization between Israel and the likes of Saudi Arabia and Syria. How badly? And where do Palestinians figure in all of this grand bargaining? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about a ceasefire on whose terms. With us from Tel Aviv, Israel's former ambassador to the United States, Itamar Rabinovich. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
From Washington, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, Gaza native resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Also in the U.S. Capitol, Avi Meyerstein, founder and president of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, umbrella group for activists. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
And she used to hang her hat in Washington as White House correspondent. France 24 International Affairs editor, Ketevan Gordestani. How are you?
Good.
You can, by the way, listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. No ambushes planned so far. The White House only announcing a private dinner between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, closed to the press. This while Israel and Hamas take part in indirect talks in Qatar. Emerald Maxwell has more.
It's Benjamin Netanyahu's third visit to Washington since Donald Trump returned to office in January, and the first since the Israeli and US presidents' recent joint strikes on Iran, hailed by both as an unmitigated success. Now Trump is hoping to keep the ball rolling with a ceasefire and hostage release deal in the Gaza war.
I think there's a good chance we have a deal with Hamas during the coming week.
Instead of the usual formal talks in the Oval Office, Trump and Netanyahu are scheduled to sit down together at a private dinner Monday. As well as Gaza, Netanyahu's hoping there will also be room for discussing new diplomatic opportunities in the region, such as normalizing ties with Lebanon, Syria and Saudi Arabia.
This is an opportunity to expand the circle of peace far beyond what we could have imagined before. We've already transformed the face of the Middle East beyond recognition and have the opportunity and ability to change it even more.
But top of the agenda is the US-backed proposal for a 60-day Gaza ceasefire, on the second day of indirect talks between an Israeli delegation and Hamas officials in Doha. The deal reportedly includes the release of 10 Israeli living hostages, the handover of 18 hostage bodies, and the release of Palestinians held in Israeli jails, as well as an increase in aid allowed into the enclave, Israeli troop withdrawals from parts of Gaza, and discussions on ending the war entirely. An end to the war has long been the sticking point to a deal. Hamas has always demanded a halt to the fighting and Israel's withdrawal before it would free remaining hostages, while Israel has insisted that all hostages are freed and Hamas dismantled first.
So ahead of that dinner at the White House, we're seeing a lot of chatter, some of it contradictory over how well progress is going or not. Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, give us a cheat sheet here. How will we know if it's going well?
Well, I'm looking at a lot of Arabic media, and I'm looking at Al Jazeera. I'm looking at what Hamas-affiliated Telegram channels are saying. And there really does seem to be a serious desire by Hamas to reach a deal. On the other hand, they are very much so dragging this out and going into the minutia, the smallest of details, to ensure not just the classic demands like a full withdrawal of the Israeli military, like the restoration of humanitarian supplies and aid distribution through the regular channels, but in effect, conditions that would allow for Hamas's political and gubernatorial survival, if you will. Hamas wants to maintain some thread of relevance in a post-war scenario. The people of Gaza have been publicly making unimaginably strongly worded statements against Hamas, saying, accept the deal already. Hamas feels that pressure. On the other hand, Hamas realizes that this batch of hostages that it has in its hand are its last leverage in pushing for a deal. As for Mr. Netanyahu, I think that there's a recognition that after what happened in Iran, now is the time to capitalize on that victory. And so I sense that there is a willingness to try and potentially wind down the war, but he's held hostage by the far right elements in his government. And so it's really, it's a flip of a coin right now to tell whether or not Mr. Trump is going to be the deciding factor in really winding this down and bringing about a ceasefire.
All right, on Sunday, Israel's war cabinet again announcing that it was approving a return of humanitarian aid to the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Itamar Rabinovich, is that an indicator of anything?
Yeah, there is greater interest in northern Gaza than in southern Gaza for Israel. It may be a compromise, but this is not the key issue. There are other issues at home. There is the question of the government's survival. There is the issue of a universal draft, including the ultra-religious, which is now another hot potato that Mr. Netanyahu needs to deal with. And more broadly, the next Israeli election is planned for late 2026. In all likelihood, it will take place earlier. And Mr. Netanyahu will have to calculate very carefully how it works for him. Israeli elections take at least 100 days. There are no snap elections. And a lot can happen within 100 days. It's a gamble, and he does not like to gamble. I think much depends on what happens this week. If it's a successful visit, then he could proceed. And let's also look at this curious arrangement for the visit. Not the usual meeting in the Oval Office with journalists coming in, but a private dinner ending at 1 a.m. Israel time. I think no one wants to take chances. If it's a failure, then they would like to minimize it. If it's a success, then they can have another event with journalists and enjoy the success of the meeting. It's still all open. They want to reduce expectations, not to raise them.
Yeah, and Kedevan Gorgistani was telling us, Avi Meyerstein, earlier that Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to stay in Washington until Thursday. Does that lend credence to what you just heard there from Ambassador Rabinovich, that they're giving themselves plenty of leeway to announce good news and stay far from the cameras if they still need to push?
Absolutely. And from what I've heard, the longer visit also includes interactions with a variety of figures between Netanyahu and folks in the U.S. administration, as well as possibly some community supporters who are here. So there are many different stakeholders they may be trying to engage. But I just wanted to add a note, because there's a lot of talk, obviously, because of our expectations and our hopes that there will be a ceasefire. A lot of talk about getting to the deal, but just to remind everyone, there was a deal. Israel and Hamas had reached a deal that Biden had first announced, saying it was Netanyahu's deal a whole year ago. It didn't get signed and sealed until January, with Trump coming in and having supported it. And so there were 2 months where there was a hostage deal and ceasefire. Dozens of hostages came home. Aid went in for a spell. and then it stopped. And that was mostly a decision by Prime Minister Netanyahu not to negotiate the second stage of the deal, which the deal called for, and instead to relaunch the war. So that's going to have to be different too, not just getting to the deal, but making sure the deal is structured in such a way that the likelihood of someone backing out is very slim. And I think a piece of that may be trying to compress the timeline. Everybody's talking about 60 days. It's not clear why it has to take that long.
And so do you see this being compressed? Do you see that happening? Or in the end, is it, like was the case with the war with Iran, what Benjamin Netanyahu wants, Benjamin Netanyahu gets?
I haven't heard too many people. I've heard a few, not too many, talking about compressing it. So that's maybe wishful thinking in some corners. It does, the way they're talking about it now does resemble the structure of a lot of the prior deals that have existed in terms of staged return of hostages, ceasefire, staged withdrawal of Israeli forces from certain areas, and then a period of negotiations for how you're going to cement ending the war. So just based on history, one probably would bet that it's going to look more like that staged, possibly 60 days. But it's worth people thinking about how we make sure that the deal doesn't just get made, but gets upheld and implemented.
Kerevan Gorgistani, you heard Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib saying at the end of the day, a lot hinges on Donald Trump. Is it on Donald Trump or is it on Benjamin Netanyahu ultimately that this hinges?
Well, look, Benjamin Netanyahu, in a way, owes Donald Trump a little bit. If you look back at the last few weeks, especially what happened with the strikes in Iran. And so there is a better relationship right now between the two men than there was maybe a short while ago. And
was it bad before?
It was complicated, we'll say, because Donald Trump has a few times expressed a little bit of frustration with Benjamin Netanyahu, but at the same time has expressed support for him. The issue here is that Benjamin Netanyahu obviously has his own goals, but Donald Trump has his goal. And Donald Trump, there is nobody above Donald Trump. So if Donald Trump wants a deal, he will do whatever it takes to get to that deal. What that deal entails is very different. But Donald Trump has been claiming for months, even before getting back into the Oval Office, that he was going to deal with what is happening in Gaza. He was going to get a ceasefire. He said it again. And he wants that deal because he's the deal maker. He doesn't really care that much, maybe, about what happens after the 60 days potentially, because what he wants is a win right now. The quickest win is the road he's going with. So you could have possibly a situation where you get Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to the 60-day truce. And then, because the wording is a little bit loose, as Avi was saying, you sort of repeat the past and you end up, after the 60 days, having Donald Trump saying, look, I tried, I had a ceasefire, and now you guys, as we heard him say about Israel and Iran, don't know what the F you're doing, and I'm bored with this situation. So I think what Donald Trump wants at the most is to have a very quick win, to be able to have that victory lap and push the can down the road about what it means to end the war in real terms.
Itamar Rabinovich, how hard does Donald Trump press for a quick deal?
You know, the last time we had a deal, Mr. Witkoff, his emissary, came to Jerusalem on a Friday. He called Benjamin Netanyahu and told him, I want to come see you tomorrow. Netanyahu said, tomorrow is Saturday, I don't work on Saturday. And Witkoff said, I will come at 10:30. And he came and he pushed and there was a deal. So when President Trump really wants it, he knows how to push, but he also tries to keep at least the appearance of cooperation and friendly relations. And let's not remember that there is something bigger, or at least as big as Gaza, on the table, which is Iran. I mean, the war ended. There is no negotiation. There's the question of how exactly it ended, how much uranium is left, would Iran go nuclear? How does one go from here? The two of them need to come to very close agreement and cooperation, I think, on the larger Iranian issue.
So in other words, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, that's where the crux of the matter is over dinner?
I want to just quickly say that I understand the idea that Mr. Trump is looking for a quick win. However, I actually think there could be something fundamentally different here. Let's not forget that what is different now is the desire to expand the Abraham Accords, the Abraham Alliance, as it's being touted by elements of the Trump administration. Let's not forget that Mr. Trump wants to look at Saudi Arabia normalization prospects as being fundamental to reshaping the Middle East. And Gaza, in a way, helps unlock that. Gaza and some sort of a resolution to the Israel and Palestine conflict, even if it's artificial or superficial, is going to be key for that grand strategy, for that grand victory. So I would argue that there's a lot more incentive for President Trump to pressure there.
But to pressure, yes, but to pressure immediately?
I think so, yes, because we have a weakened Hamas. We have, everybody's still riding high from what seemed to be a tactical, at least, perhaps it's strategic, but a nevertheless tactical victory against Iran over the ended 2 weeks ago. And so, yes, there is now a moment in which there's an opening, there's an opportunity, and the Qataris, in a desperate desire to prevent further targeting of their country by Iranian ballistic missiles, as happened on the closing day of the war, they want to end the Gaza conflict because they see, this started in Gaza, this ends in Gaza. And so I strongly believe that there is incentive, not out of necessarily care for the Palestinian civilians, although we have seen President Trump make what sounded like compassionate remarks about the suffering of the people in Gaza. But I think there's a grand strategy here at play. And as far as what my friend and colleague Avi said, I would remind us all that part of this stretch timeline is something that Hamas very much so wanted, and actually something that I think Hamas is going to insist upon right now and double down on, based on what happened earlier this year, because they want enough time to go back and forth and work on the minutia. That's the thing about Hamas, is that they may be, I think, evil and horrible, but they got the details down to the smallest of line items. And so they want enough time to really go back and forth. They have all this time, this experience from previous wars in which the Egyptian intelligence, in which they worked with the Qatari mediators to work out details of how to bring about the end of the conflict. And I think they're leveraging their negotiating experience right now to ensure their survival. Unfortunately, much space has been vacated. The Palestinian Authority is practically non-existent in the negotiations for the end of the war in Gaza. The Arab League, the Arab moderate Sunni states, they're very much so awaiting Hamas's defeat or exit from the scene, but they've sort of been on the sidelines. And so Hamas, with its Qatari backers, have been really spearheading the negotiations. And so I'm worried that while, yes, there's been horrendous suffering in the Gaza Strip, I think there's an alignment right now in the interests of Donald Trump, potential alignment in the interest of Benjamin Netanyahu, and Hamas is going to leverage that with the remaining hostages to remain in power, which is going to be disastrous for the people of Gaza.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, you flagged Israeli support for the Abu Shabaab militia group in Gaza. Its leader over the weekend confirming in an interview with Israeli public radio station Makan that it's made inroads into hitherto Hamas-controlled areas, stating that, for instance, that we entered these areas and carried out operations beyond expectations, as long as the goal is support and assistance from the Israeli Defense Forces and nothing more. When we go on a mission, we inform them, nothing beyond that, and we carry out the military operation. This is an organization that's been called a criminal gang by many. So is that just Avi Meyerstein leveraging, or is Israel serious about trying to replace Hamas in the Gaza Strip?
I'm not sure that that counts as a long-term plan for replacing Hamas. In fact, I think there are folks on the right in Israel who are hopeful you can play this game where you support some alternative armed group and they're never going to turn against you. And I think as long as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at its core is not resolved, there's always going to be someone representing Palestinians who are going to be taking different pathways. We have the moderates who are trying to take a path of nonviolence through negotiations, and then we have the extremists like Hamas and whoever may come and replace them. And I think you asked about, is this all going to happen during dinner? I think really one of the things we have to crack open here is doing things a lot differently. It's a time to pivot in many ways. It's a time for Netanyahu to pivot toward a broader base. There are 75% of Israelis who are ready to support that kind of regional peace accord with a Palestinian state, according to polling we did just a few weeks ago. In the West Bank, 73% supported a two-state solution in May. So there's support for that kind of stuff, but we have to pivot towards those broader bases of people that are willing to push for diplomatic solutions and start to sideline the extremists. And you've got to deal with Hamas while they're holding your hostages and while they're holding guns in Gaza, but very quickly have to pivot towards talking to a much broader crowd who are focused on solving the conflict. And this latest group, I think, is maybe part of a short-term solution for some, but ultimately you really need to be building those broad bases of support for conflict resolution, not just managing it.
Itamar Rabinovich, you mentioned earlier the rules of the game in Israel. If Benjamin Netanyahu decides that his far-right coalition partners are expendable and that he will pivot towards something more moderate, as expressed there by Avi, there are risks involved, you were telling us. At this point, what's the calculus for, again, a man who was Prime Minister of Israel for the first time back in 1996?
Right. It's been a long time. He, of course, the question for him is against what background he goes to the next election. Hopefully, from his point of view, normalization with Saudi Arabia, he would then be the prime minister who, in a way, brought the peaceful process with the Arab world to a new high. In order for that to happen, there has to be an end to the war in Gaza, and there has to be at least an indication of renewal of negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, with the prospect, I emphasize, not tomorrow morning, the prospect of Palestinian statehood. That's what the Saudis demand. If that happens, he has a very persuasive platform to run on. But if he ends up running against the backdrop of a partial deal with Hamas, with only part of the hostages coming back, maybe there are 20 alive, 10 to be included in this presumed next deal. 10 are going to stay behind. If they end up being returned in coffins, it's a very gloomy backdrop for him to run for elections. So, we are doing all these calculations. We don't know what the established facts are.
Well, let me ask you about the political climate here, because you heard Avi Meyerstein give us those poll numbers from inside of Israel. You've been in a country where there was a big rally on Saturday for the hostages, another one today. But again, is this just a loud minority?
No, this is the issue of the hostages and ending the war in Gaza, not doing a partial deal, but a final deal. But Avi also spoke about support for a two-state solution. I think he cited 73% support in Israel. I wish he was right. I mean, the Israeli polling numbers are different. There's still a very small majority of Israelis who want to separate from the Palestinians, a two-state solution, but the numbers are smaller than 73%. Actually, if you look at the conduct of the center-left politicians in Israel, they are weakening to the right, because the name of the game for them is to get some votes from what we call the soft right, and therefore they are taking very right-wing positions. There are very few leftists left on the Israeli political scene.
Avi Meyerstein, just one quick point on this. You know, back in October of 2023, people said, well, there's going to be a radical discourse now because of what just happened. But once the fighting ends, there'll be cooler heads that'll prevail. We'll hear more moderate voices like yours. But of course, that was then. Do you still believe that now, that when the guns go silent, voices will be heard?
I think moderate voices will be heard. I know they're clamoring to be heard. Whether they will prevail is something that I'm not sure any of us can take bets on right now. I just want to clarify to something that Itamar said. It's true that if you ask Israelis if they support a two-state solution, essentially the Oslo framing, it has seen decreasing support over many years now. But the question that we asked in our poll, which was representative polling of Israelis across society, was, do you support a full normalization deal with Saudi Arabia and the Arab world, full military, economic, security integration, including a Palestinian state? So we said the words, it was very clear, and 75% said they would support or accept that. So we do see some movement there. It certainly depends how it's framed, which is not just a matter of words. It's also a matter of the arrangements. Israelis want the normalization, the regional integration, and the Palestinian state, as Ahmed said earlier, is a key to unlocking that. So it's part of a package. But we've got 180 organizations who are engaging with tens of thousands of people every day. And these are folks who are asking questions they never asked before about why this situation persists, why this conflict keeps getting passed from generation to generation. And I think those questions are being asked more and louder than ever before, and people are listening in a way they never did before. It doesn't mean that the moderate positions win the day, but we have a chance and an alignment that's been discussed here to really make it possible.
We have breaking news, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, which is the Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, according to the White House, is to travel to Doha later this week for discussions. Again, is that a positive sign?
Well, it just goes to show that I think that there will be an all-out effort by President Trump to really try and make this happen. And really, I mean, he's going to invest a lot of his political capital, a lot of his sway, if you will, with Prime Minister Netanyahu. But just on if I may, on the point that Avi just made, I mean, yes, I hope there is a reckoning after the war, both inside Israel, as far as the policies that led to Hamas's entrenchment, the policies of Prime Minister Netanyahu that allowed for Qatari funding to go to the terror group in a supposed 3D chess game to keep the Palestinians divided, to slow down or kill the prospects of a two-state solution, to keep the Palestinian Authority weak and irrelevant, allowing Hamas to build the tunnel infrastructure and the weaponry infrastructure that was used on October 7th. There has to be accountability for that. That cannot go unanswered. In the same way that I hope and I am confident that when the guns go silent, there will also be hopefully louder, moderate Palestinian voices. It doesn't mean they'll win. It doesn't mean they'll become the majority, but there will be increasing moderate voices within the Palestinian society and and I'm talking about actual Palestinians, not the pro-Palestine people in the diaspora, who will demand serious accountability of Hamas for handing our people on a silver platter to the most far-right government in Israel's history, causing apocalyptic levels of death and destruction that are unheard of. So I think in both societies, there could be a real opportunity once there's an actual end of the war, not just a ceasefire in which people don't know if it's the end or not, but once there's an actual end of the war, both societies, I hope, will engage in introspection and in demand accountability from their leaders and from all parties that allowed for this travesty and this atrocity to go on for almost 2 years.
If you're just joining us here in the France 24 debate, panel was talking about what is the ultimate prize beyond just a ceasefire, which is a more stable region, and for Donald Trump, normalization of ties in the region. A sweetener could be normalization for Gulf states. But there's also talk that Syria could be in the mix. Donald Trump's envoy for Syria and Lebanon, his name is Thomas Barak. He's also the ambassador to Turkey, in Beirut this Monday, where he talked up a U.S. proposal for disarming Hezbollah. Donald Trump, this is his. We saw it in that recent visit to Saudi Arabia, where he shook hands with the new master of Damascus, Ahmed al-Shara. This is what he's seeking?
Yes, I mean, this is something that he has been seeking ever since his first term. Obviously, that didn't involve Syria at the time, but the expansion of the Abraham Accords, he viewed this as probably the biggest foreign policy victory of his first term. And when he came back to the White House, the goal is to return to a situation where you can actually discuss the expansion. And as long as the situation in Gaza is not dealt with, there will be no discussion with the Saudis about possibly expanding those Abraham Accords. And the issue of Syria, it has to be noted, also happened sort of in surprise of the Israelis, who Benjamin Netanyahu and others had been pressing Donald Trump, pressing his entourage and the administration not to sort of recognize the new leadership, lift sanctions. They really did not want to see that happen. And Donald Trump went with it anyway, because he has this vision of the new Middle East, and this fits into the sort of bigger picture. So you have the ceasefire deal with Gaza, which allows you to broaden your focus on something a little bit bigger, which is possibly a sort of permanent, longer-term normalization or a tentative peace deal with Iran, which then allows you to focus on the expansion of the Abraham Accords, deals, because this has nothing to do with the world and the geopolitics, but Donald Trump does have a very serious goal, which is to have the Nobel Peace Prize, and all of that fits into his sort of self-perception as the peacemaker, which he has repeated many times over. And so the Syria aspect, the deal with Benjamin Netanyahu, what happens in Gaza, what happens in Iran, all of these are pieces of sort of the same puzzle of his new Middle East under Donald Trump, where everybody will live peacefully in that region.
Itamar Rabinovich, you're a career diplomat. What do you think of sending off these peacemakers who are not career diplomats to do the bargaining?
Actually, if I may correct you, I'm not a career diplomat. I'm an academic. I was drafted by Yitzhak Rabin to be his peace negotiator with Syria, and then ambassador in Washington. So I'm actually one of those. But I'd like to say something about Israel and Syria. It is true that Israel was delighted by the fact that the Assads fell, but it was very suspicious of Ahmed al-Shara, as many others were. He's a former jihadi. Did he remain a jihadi? As he moderated? And initially, Israel was hostile to him. It now is not hostile. It wants to settle a relationship. There's no hope that Syria will join the Abraham Accords, because there is a Golan issue that is an obstacle to that. But Israel and Syria can come to a good working relationship under a different title. That's a possibility. And if that happens, that would also be very welcome.
And would the Palestinians be a factor, or could some kind of normalization happen with or without a settlement in Gaza?
No, there is no commitment. There's no commitment to the Palestinians in that regard. People would like, in the Arab world, if I may, would like to see obviously this war and the suffering come to an end. They would like to see progress and resolution on the larger Palestinian issue. But there is a certain fatigue. The original Abraham Accords, going back to Trump's first term, were an indication that a country like the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and so forth, in a way told the Palestinians, we gave you 50, 60 years, it goes nowhere, we have to look after our own interest. Of course, there is a public opinion, the social media, they have to take that into account and to do the politics of it, but it is doable.
All right, so Donald Trump likes deals, as Ketevan was saying, in particular real estate deals. He shocked the world back in April when he defended his Gaza on the Riviera concept.
They locked him in. We didn't lock him in. They're locked in.
You know how I feel about the Gaza
And what is-
Strip. I think it's an incredible piece of important real estate, and I think it's something that we would be involved in, but having a peace force like the United States there, controlling and owning the Gaza Strip would be a good thing.
All right, I don't know if he's still clinging to the hope of a Gaza on the Riviera project, but there certainly have been revelations the last few days. The plan to relocate 500,000 Palestinians was modeled and evaluated by U.S. business consulting giant BCG, the Boston Consulting Group. According to the Financial Times, for a fee of $4 million, senior management claims it disavowed work on the scheme, a scheme that, according to the same Financial Times, was discussed in calls and text messages with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, the nonprofit headed by the former UK Prime Minister. It was essentially in listening mode and never endorsed the relocation of Palestinians. Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, your reaction to this story?
Well, there are two parallel tracks. On the one hand, there is what I have publicly and firmly come out against, which is, and I've called it comical. I wrote a piece in The Atlantic in which I said there is no real estate solution to the Gaza Strip. In response to Trump's idea that the U.S. will take over, the U.S. will run it, this will be, the Riviera, etc.
Yeah, these are promotional videos we're seeing that are artificially intelligence generated.
Precisely. I mean, it would be a joke if it weren't talking about a serious matter that involves a war in which over 60,000 people have been killed, including members of my own family. So there's that track of it. However, there is something else that I have been promoting as something that should be Palestinian-led and inspired and celebrated, which is that Gaza can and should be the jewel of the Palestinian people, not the Singapore, the Paris of the Middle East, of the Mediterranean, but as a role model for effective Palestinian self-governance, as an example of Palestinian agency, allocation of resources, the balancing of different competing interests, as a compelling display of what an occupation-free West Bank can and should look like. And so those can be totally separated and disentangled. And there needs to be an inspiring vision for Gaza after the war, even with all the horrendous death and destruction. And I actually, think that's the only thing that we can do to keep hope within our people, because right now, over half of the Gaza Strip, they would love nothing more than to leave and never come back to this dark place. And I would love for an opportunity for the Palestinian people to actually remain steadfast, give them the option for a dignified life on their land. I get anxious sometimes when I see some of these big fancy iterations done by the big fancy corporate giants, because it reeks of capitalism that's going to work for a small number of people, that like the oligarchs that we have in the West Bank, and it's going to keep everybody else in Gaza aid dependent and reliant on handouts from the NGO industrial complex. And that's not what I want. So I think it's very important to speak out against attempts to forcibly displace the Palestinian people. That is shameful. That should be called out. And no one should be speaking of that. I think it's important that we shun any idea that somehow the United States, through a real estate solution, can make all of Gaza. Gaza has a matrix of problems that need a serious solution, not something that President Trump comes up with on the fly next to Benjamin Netanyahu, for goodness sake. On the other hand, I think we should absolutely promote just a broader, inspiring vision for Gaza being, having a seaport. And I mean, Gaza's the only territory on the Mediterranean that doesn't have a seaport. and hasn't had one for over 50 years. Gaza has an abundance of labor. It could have data centers. It should be connected to Saudi Arabia. It should be connected through rail and fiber optics, and the sky is the limit for imagination, but it needs to work for Palestinians, not for multinational corporations that come and suck the blood out of Gaza.
Avi Meyerstein, we're running short on time, but I know there are several reconstruction plans being talked about, even though we don't yet have a ceasefire. What's the most realistic option?
I think Ahmed touched on a super important point, and it's one of the things we have to do differently this time, which is we have to center the people, the Israeli and Palestinian people, in any process that moves forward. They need the rest of the world to help them, to support them, to launch diplomatic processes, to give security guarantees, invest. They need all of that from the rest of the world, but they can't just be acted upon like pawns. They need to be agents in their own future. And we had an event in Paris hosted by President Macron just a few weeks ago with several hundred Israelis and Palestinians working on very detailed plans, talking about some of the very things that Ahmed mentioned and thinking about them in a very tangible, concrete way to deliver to the international community so it can support what Israelis and Palestinians themselves want for their future.
Avi Meyerstein, before you can get to rebuilding, the guns first have to go silent and the people have to be fed. This current Israeli U.S. scheme, GHF, does it still continue after a ceasefire?
It sure feels like it's had an awful number of struggles and tragedies. Hundreds of people have been killed trying to access food through that mechanism. Meanwhile, we have this entire support framework of international organizations that were working before and are ready to work again. So without regard to whether GHF is part of the solution, it seems like in order to meet the needs, which are so desperate in Gaza, it's probably going to have to open up to bring back those international humanitarian organizations that do this work every day all around the world.
Do you see Donald Trump bending on this, Ketevan Gorjestani, and bringing back the United Nations?
Well, according to the proposal that was sent to Hamas, it seems that that is the plan. When the line, according to the Associated Press, the line about increasing humanitarian aid mentions that it would be distributed by the United Nations, and importantly, it does not mention GHF. Not that it says no, but it doesn't mention it there, and it sort of feels a little bit like you create a problem, you create a fund that's been a disaster by all accounts, and then it seems like a sort of concession to the Palestinians, to Hamas, to say, well, okay, look, we are bringing back the United Nations now after creating a problem by ourselves and seeing that it was a disaster that a lot of people had said it would be. So it looks like at least it was in the proposal. Whether or not that will stay in the final writing of whatever deal is possibly agreed, there are a lot of ifs, but that was one of the elements that seemed to go at least away from GHF.
All right, and for now, they're still in the haggling mode, both in Washington and in Doha. Ketevan Gorjestani, I want to thank you. I want to thank Avi Meyerstein and Fouad Al-Khatib for being with us from Washington. Itamar Rabinovich in Tel Aviv, thank you for being with us here in the France 2040 debate.